Thanks for joining us once again. I'm Sammy K. Powers, and this is the PHP Roundtable. This is a live podcast of developers discussing topics that PHP nerds care about. The ultimate goal of this podcast is to learn a little something from each other. And if you're listening live and want to be a part of the show, send a tweet to PHP Roundtable with a question, and we'll try to get your question answered on the show if we can. So today, we're talking documentation and developer experience. Documentation can make or break a project, but it's often overlooked until the very end. And if we don't think about how the developers will interact with our code, our project could end up with a very ugly API. Today we're discussing some strategies that we can implement in our own projects to improve the overall developer experience. And we've got some people here who know a thing or two about documentation and developer experience. So one at a time in no particular order, we'll start off with Ryan Weaver. He is the Symfony documentation lead and writer for K&P University. Welcome, Ryan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's probably a lot of people out there that are like, oh yeah, I like the Symfony documentation, and then probably like a lot of people that are like, oh, that's the jerk.
That's the guy.
Yeah.
Also, we have Taylor Otwell. He's the creator of Laravel, a little not very well-known web framework. Welcome, Taylor.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, man. And finally, Frank de Jonge. He's the member of the PHP Lead Leadership Group and maintainer of Fly System. Welcome, Frank.
Hi, good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, guys. So I want to ask each one of you, before we dive into too much documentation and developer experience, technical stuff, how did each one of you start caring about developer experience? Where did that show up? I'll start off maybe with you, Ryan. When did developer experience become a big deal for you?
Yeah, it's actually interesting you have Taylor on here, because probably indirectly because of Taylor. The developer experience, because I'm on the Symfony side of things, didn't start when we started writing the documentation for Symfony. Writing the documentation for Symfony was probably a lot like what everybody else deals with, where you write a big library and then you go, oh no, I don't have any documentation. So Symfony was actually built, more or less, and then we were catching up for the first 2 or 3 years on documentation. And it wasn't about even, it's more about just figuring out how to accomplish something and then just kind of like documenting it. And then only like years later did we look back at those and say, was that even like the easiest way or the best way to accomplish something? So I brought up Taylor basically because about a year or two ago, when Laravel was getting really popular, that forced us in the Symfony world to actually like look back at ourselves and say, like, you know, why do people like Laravel so much, and like why do people say that Symfony is really hard? And so, you know, good competition there. That's when I started actually looking back and just looking kind of problem by problem by problem and saying, like, you know, how do I do X in Symfony? You look at the documentation for it, and as an expert, I would say, yeah, I follow that. But at the same time, that's absolutely insane. Like, that's insane that you'd have to go through those 15 steps to solve that very common problem. So it's been from kind of like originated, honestly, from Laravel, and then from there, just trying to like get other people to think about that as well, kind of like in the grander ecosystem.
That's cool that Laravel was some of the inspiration. So let's trace that back a little further. Taylor, where did developer experience become a big deal for you, especially with working with Laravel and things?
So with regards to Laravel, which I released it in 2011, and the PHP sort of open source space is sort of crowded, and there's lots of different frameworks and libraries and stuff like that. So when I first released Laravel, I felt like documentation would be really huge in terms of if it was going to make it or just be a flop, kind of, because a lot of people had complained about. People complain all the time about open source libraries not having good documentation across all types of languages. And so I really wanted to have great documentation from the very first impression, the very first day, because I felt like if I could make a good first impression, and get a small community going, then things could grow from there. So I didn't want to release anything that was sort of like beta quality with like a note that says like docs coming soon or something like that. I didn't really want to do anything like that because people would lose interest, and you sort of miss that initial kind of like launch excitement and opportunity. So it was just sort of important to me from the beginning, and I guess kind of part of my personality too is just kind of being like a neat freak and kind of wanting everything to be just right, and that kind of played into the documentation, wanting that to be well done as well.
I know CodeIgniter had was hailed as having really great documentation for a long time, and
Yeah.
so what makes Laravel on top of that even more kind of better for the developer experience other than just great documentation? And like, when did you kind of start bridging a gap between great documentation and then also just great developer experience with working with the project itself?
So Laravel is to explain Laravel, you sort of have to understand where it comes from to understand kind of like the philosophy behind it. And at the time, I was working doing enterprise.net, and I wanted to launch a startup. Everyone kind of has like random startup ideas come into their head or whatever, and I had a few, and I wanted to try to launch them. And PHP was more convenient than doing it in .NET at the time because hosting's cheaper. It's easier to deploy, or at least it was at the time. And so I wanted to kind of have a foundation for building things just me or with one other person, like a very small team, very quickly. So I wanted to solve the common problems we would have, like authentication and, of course, like our ORM and templating and template inheritance and all those kind of common frameworky type problems. And I wanted them to be easy enough to where a small team could really get going really quickly. And so that's why Laravel is kind of, you could say it's sort of focused on rapid development and took some inspiration from Rails and stuff like that because it was really geared for one or one person or two or three people building their startup idea. And over the years, it's kind of grown to have more suitable features for more like enterprise applications. But at its heart, at its very beginning, it was really to be very rapid for a small team.
I think it's great that these projects are inspiring each other. Rails inspiring Laravel and Laravel inspiring Symfony and things like that, and how when you have a great developer experience as a developer, it's like I want to deliver this great experience to other developers too, because I know I've also been inspired by Symfony and Laravel both, and a lot of the packages in the PHP League. And Frank, you actually work on one of the bigger ones there, the Fly system. What kind of inspired you to focus on developer experience, or what was your experience with that?
Yeah, well, for me, it was kind of different from what I heard from Ryan and Taylor. For me, it was really a personal thing. When I entered like the professional developer space, so to say, I was kind of isolated most of the times, and I had a small shop with a buddy. I did most of the back-end stuff, and then when I transitioned into doing more stuff open source, and also I quit that company and started doing more freelance work where I was exposed to teams. And all of a sudden I was encountered with having to bring the ideas across to either people that I did not know or see or speak with at all, like in the open source community, or with just total random strangers on project teams. And if you then just have your your brainchilds there that you understand but nobody else, you're the guy that either people won't accept packages from because it's fully in your head, and if you're working with somebody like that, you're the guy that's hard to work with. So for me, the main motivation was purely personal.
Cool. So have you seen?
So
good
are you
results?
saying?
Oh, go ahead.
Are you saying that in your code, what were you shooting for there? Was it kind of code that is kind of like readable, or are you talking about documentation or code that's simple enough that you wouldn't have to explain it to somebody else? Because I think this is an interesting point.
That's the first thing. Like codes that you really have to like know through and through in order to work with it. I think that's unusable. It's just a bad experience from the consuming side of a library or a framework or whatever. And when everybody starts out programming, and especially in the PHP world, I guess it's quite common just to have those kind of stuff, and that because you know it through and through, you don't really see the ugly side of the thing you have created. But to show that to other people and have other people react with it on it, it's kind of like this mirror that reflects it back onto you, and you're confronted with this ugly side, and then like, well, either you don't change it and things will never improve then, or you take that advice to heart and try to find and research better ways of doing that stuff.
Mm-hmm. So I think that to get away from the like kind of open sourcey side of things, like as part of my job, I get to look at a lot of other people's code, and usually it's somebody who has kind of like Frank is talking about, has inherited a project that somebody else built, and they have no idea what's going on. And most of the time, it's because of just massive over abstraction, like people being too smart. And especially, this is different than in an open source project, because obviously in an open source project you need abstraction, and so people can extend things. But even that can be taken too far. But especially in a closed source project, so in developer experiences, it's for open source, but also those closed source projects. I see people routinely going way too far. Every time they create a class, they'll create an interface behind it, and then they'll type in that interface everywhere in their own private project, where they're never going to have a different implementation of that interface. And they'll have factories on top of other things, to the point when even a seasoned developer like us, we would look at the code and be like, I really don't understand what's going on here in this closed source project. Yeah. So, extending that to open source, it's like, can somebody look at your code or the directions for using your code and have those more or less make sense? Or do I go to your GitHub repository, and when I get there, I read the first 3 paragraphs, like the first 4 code blocks, and I'm still asking, what does this library even do? So I think in terms of like something like Fly System, that's something that's like fairly well defined. When you look at Fly System, you can sort of look at a couple code blocks, and you're like, oh, that's awesome, I totally get it. It solves this one specific problem, and it makes sense to me. So it's not like solving too big of a problem. The code is not like super abstract. You're not like creating like 4 factories and reading 2 pages of documentation before you've like read your first file from the local file system or something absurdly simple like that. So I mean, that would be like one piece of advice out there, private or public. Just don't make it super crazy. Try to keep things simple. And one easy way to do that is to tackle as small of a problem as possible if you're working on like an open source library.
Yeah, and define what kind of problem you're tackling. You see a lot of projects that tackle a concept that is not super well defined. And this is what I spent a lot of time in when I was initially developing Fly System, was really to get down to the nitty-gritty of what is the space of file systems. So define that first, and then see how everything else fits into that concept. And by doing that, you test your the concept that you've created, basically. So for me, more practically, I needed to map a lot of different file systems to this one interface. And if somewhere along the way something didn't fit right, that would be a hint for me that something in the interface was not well thought out, or not thought out enough. So a clear indication, like, I need to spend more time in this particular section. But yeah, just reiterating over stuff until you like hit the sweet spot, and yeah, it really pays off.
For sure. I'm curious, Taylor, what would you consider when you were talking about developer experience, what entails developer experience? We've been just kind of throwing it around, but haven't really kind of clearly defined it. Is it documentation and clean APIs? I mean, are there more to developer experience for you?
I mean, that documentation and clean APIs is obviously probably the majority of it. I also just try to kind of minimize frustration, so making things intuitive to where things sort of work naturally as you're coding with a library. Things sort of just, you can sort of almost guess how to use it just without even reading the documentation, is something that we usually shoot for. But yeah, with Laravel, we try to kind of minimize frustration throughout the whole, I call it like the whole project pipeline. So that kind of all starts with Homestead, and because setting up your local development environment is sort of like worlds of frustration a lot of times. So we try to minimize frustration there, and then of course with the framework itself, with documentation, and then Laracast, and then with Forge for deployment is sort of the broad overview of the whole pipeline. And every step of the way, we just try to we have to make some assumptions, of course, with Laravel. So, things like Homestead, we make an assumption that we use Nginx. It's just what it ships with. It doesn't ship with Apache. So we have to make some kind of limiting conventions and assumptions, but that's all sort of with the goal of minimizing frustration whenever possible.
Yeah, that's it seems like it can really, if we think about it, if we include DevOps and even like how you're standing or sitting at your desk or something, developer experience could actually be pretty broad. But I guess for this kind of episode, we've been focusing more on documentation and API specifically. So speaking of documentation, Ryan, you had given a talk at Sunshine PHP of 2015 this year, and it's seriously one of the most influential talks I've ever been to that has kind of affected my daily life so much. So when I program and write documentation. So I'm just curious what your definition of good documentation is. What is good documentation for you? Yeah,
that was a fun talk. It was one of those talks where Sammy was in the front row, and he was like looking at me like this the whole time. So it was really easy to get to because at least one guy was really, really excited about what I was saying. So just making eye contact. Yeah, so man, good documentation, and it's interesting because in the Symfony world, like I said, we came at it in a different way, which is like we just had to document this massive kind of like framework, and then afterwards sort of like looked and said what lessons have we learned from that. And in Symfony world, we have some extra challenges too. We're less opinionated than Laravel. Just that's our position in the market, because obviously Symfony has its like low-level components, so you need to document those, for somebody that's going to use like just HTTP Foundation component by itself, and then you have to document the whole framework, which is a totally different audience that they might not even realize that Symfony is broken down into components, and so we have some extra challenges there. But I mean, the first thing I would say about good documentation is establishing, and this is one of the things I talked about in that, establishing the 5-minute experience, which is basically you have 5 minutes to hook somebody, and at this point, you need to get them from 0 to success in 5 minutes as quickly as possible without getting hung up on things. They're only going to give you a little bit of attention. You have to grab that and get them excited to go on further. We all know programming, there's going to be like tons of pitfalls. So for example, here's what you don't want to do, and here's what most people do. You go and say like, oh, I want to learn how to, I don't know, like use some framework or use some library or something. And the first 5 paragraphs of the documentation are like weird summaries, philosophical summaries of like what they were doing and where they were born and weird things like that, followed by 2 different like warning blocks about if you're using like MS SQL over like ODBC on Windows 95, then you have to like set these character encoding things, and then like way down at the bottom of the page you finally get this sort of half-assed version of documentation. So 5-minute experience, I train a lot of people too, so I'll see them like reading down this stuff, being like, where's my start menu? I don't even, they're on a Mac, they're like, what? I don't know what this Windows stuff is, and they don't even realize it doesn't apply to them. Versus something else where it's like, you go in front of it and like the first thing you see is like code blocks, that kind of like show you what they do. And even to put this a little bit closer down to like 15-second experience. Like what's the initial impression that they give, and I'll throw this again back to like Laravel. When you go to Laravel's site, like the first thing you see is actually like a really tiny code block that just kind of like oh, that's interesting, gets you excited, and even shows a little bit of like what goes on there, and from there you can kind of click and get that 5-minute experience. So first thing with documentation is like just that 5-minute experience. Does it make sense? Kind of put it together, or am I going to get bored or frustrated immediately? So that would be like one of the things I would say. Like if you're listening to this and you are an open source library person, like look at your docs. Like are you boring your users? Are you giving them all kinds of weird Windows stuff first, or are you just letting them have some success and building some confidence first?
That's a really great point. That was one of the points from your talk that really stuck with me, is that 5-minute experience. And the the brand new PHP SDK for Facebook finally got released. Woohoo! And I was actually the primary author for that documentation, and I had written it before your talk. And there's a getting started, which is basically the 5-minute intro. And I was going through it, and I'm realizing like this is a lot longer than 5 minutes. And just like you said, there's like all this like, oh, and this caveat when you do this or when you do this, and like there's all these kind of like stipulations in this supposed to be like really quick, get you installed and going. But all that stuff might be a kind of a setback if you're thinking, oh, the documentation has to be really, detailed, which it does, but maybe just having a special section just for, that 5-minute experience of just kind of like, here's up and going, and then if they wanted to dive deeper, they could. So kind of on that note, how would you organize the documentation? Maybe I'll go with you, Taylor, since you've got quite a bit of documentation you manage as well on the Laravel side. Where was the process of organizing all that stuff? Where do you even start?
That's a really hard thing to figure out. We've tried a few different ways. We've had quick starts that are sort of like, they walk you through creating like a quick project, maybe like a quick blog or something like that. So that's one option you could take, and that's pretty popular and can be pretty useful. Right now, I think we just have getting started installing Homestead and then like basic routing, because it's always hard to define like the scope, like you were talking about. How detailed do you want to get? Like, is your quick start going to, is it going to talk about form validation, saving to the database, controllers, views, writing forms in your HTML? There's a lot that goes into even just a simple CRUD quick start. Has a lot more content than you might think at the start. So it's always tough for me, and it still is tough for me. So this is a good discussion to figure out how much do you include in that 5-minute hook that you're trying to give people. And I don't know if I have a really great answer for that. We've tried a few different things, and they're all kind of tough and have their pros and cons. So right now, we sort of have just the basic install and routing, but I kind of miss the quick start, and I think it's a good thing to have. And one thing that Symfony has that's really cool is like that sample application, which is new. So they have like a full sample application you can actually pull down from GitHub and play with and look at the code. So that's sort of like, that serves as almost like a quick start, but with even more detail to where you can actually run it on your machine and tinker with things. So that's another cool option too.
Nice.
Yeah, I think one thing that we're trying to figure out, we're like in the same boat with that, with basically that quick start thing right now, because we have one, but it's kind of like grown out of date and grown in kind of weird ways. And one of the discussions we're having, and this doesn't apply to everybody, it applies mostly to frameworks, because we have like that problem of it being like this big, not just like
right.
File system. And I mean that in a good way, Frank. Like your problem is this big, which is awesome. Don't make it any bigger. Yeah, it's good. We're trying, we're asking a question. When you have that quick start with a framework, do you have people actually code along with it? Is that the expectation, or is it more just like an advertisement? Like I said, the homepage of Laravel, it shows you like 5 lines of code. Like clearly, I'm not expected to put that into a file, put .php on the end of it, and have that work.
Yeah.
So if I had to guess, I would put it on the part of like you're not supposed to code along with that 5-minute experience. You just like it's like fireworks, bing bang boom, and then kind of like forward them along. Otherwise, the other problem too is you're just duplicating documentation. If I like go into detail talking about routing, I'm also gonna have a routing chapter. So now you have things kind of duplicated.
Yeah.
For me, as you said, the scope is a lot smaller, and there is like really simple use cases to use Fly System, but one of the more semi-complicated things would be to handle user uploads. So actually, what I did a while back was create a recipes section on the documentation for Fly System, and just have like, how would you handle uploads? Just that one scenario, and then in different frameworks. So there's an example for using Symfony, using Laravel 5, even Laravel 4, Yi. Like people contribute to that, and it's like, if people want to get started, this is one of the first hurdles they might get stuck on, because it's like, okay, I've got this tool and I've got this framework. How do I connect the two, or how do I make them talk? So by identifying that pain point and addressing it right away, it takes away a lot of the questions. I actually never have questions about about that ever. Just handled in like one page of documentation and no more maintenance load on that. So it's like identifying problem spots in use cases, even if they shouldn't be handled in code, is an easy win.
Well, the mention of duplicate docs is interesting because if you think about all the entry points that somebody could come into your docs, maybe they're not coming in from that getting started. Maybe they already kind of know how to get going with general installation and stuff, but their entry point is from this obscure side. How do you handle that sort of like thinking time, and I feel like I need to explain this component that I've already explained like 10 times over here? Like, is there a good way of kind of handling that, like knowing that there's going to be various entry points to your documentation? And this is kind of like to anybody who wants it. And I don't want to call anybody out on this one.
We're all going to avoid it.
Yeah, we just do lots of linking in between sections. It's nothing fancy. We just do lots of, if we have a word, like for example, if you come into the ORM documentation and we mention migrations, like we're going to link migrations to the migration doc. So that's, I mean, nothing fancy, but just lots of that kind of thing to help people kind of orient themselves.
I would also add, and this is one of the things, by the way, some of the things I say if you use Symfony, we don't necessarily, I'll say, hey, you should do X. We don't necessarily do X yet, you know, in the infinite world of having too much work to do and, you know, never quite getting to all these things. You know, flattening your structure. So, you know, you could have like sections within subsections of like different pages of documentation, or you can have like a little bit more of a flat structure. So, for example, this is something that, and I mentioned this in my talk too, you know, I don't love saying when we don't do things well, but in Symfony, if you want to, we do have that cookbook recipe thing, which by the way, I think is awesome. But it also means that if you want to learn about routing or forms, then we have like a chapter in our book. And we also have stuff in our component section. We also have stuff in our cookbook section, and maybe we also have stuff about forms in our reference section. So there's kind of like 4 different entry points, like paths you could go down to learn about forms. So as compared to Laravel, which seems to have a little bit of a flatter structure. So you know, if you're able to include a left navigation or some sort of navigation on your site that's like, hey, here's like the 10 topics you need to know about, the 10 main topics. And if you enter on some obscure article that's related to like some deep database thing and you're like kind of lost a little bit, at least along the left or along the top, you have like that thing that says like forms, routing, database, and you're like, okay, I'm lost, but like there's the database section. So it's flat. I can find my way around here a little bit and figure out where to go. So try to keep things like flat. That would be my recommendation, and you know, without too many clicks. Otherwise, people aren't going to figure out. They're going to get lost, like you said, and not be able to find their way out.
True that. If you have a new document, a new project that you're actually like releasing to the world, and say you've never written documentation before, what do you document? Do you document every single line? Do you explain every single line? Like, how do you even begin with that? Do you have any advice about that? And this is for anybody.
I'd say go back to like the original concept of why you created it in the first place. So really the intent, like Taylor said before, you need to know why he created Laravel in order to get a better grasp of it. If you capture that intent and base it off of that, you can say the intention and then what you discovered when exploring it, like in a really brief summary, and then the solution that you came up with. It's like 1, 2, 3, problem, scope, solution. It's like if you follow that 1, 2, 3 step, onboarding people onto your package or library is infinitely easier.
Yeah, what I usually do is I'll kind of review the public API of what I'm doing, and then I'll build the table of contents. So not like your left sidebar, but like I click a page like forms, and then I have sort of a table of contents within that page. I'll write that whole table of contents and sort of look at that for a little bit, organize it, and break it down, and and then flesh out sort of the sections, and then I'll just tackle it section by section basically. So I sort of like to make a little outline first and make sure I've got everything covered and I know kind of where certain things are going to be mentioned, and then I'll just go down the list and flesh them out.
I like that. I would add not to be different, because I actually really like both of those suggestions, especially the outlining things. To go back to like the recipe cookbook, this is basically what Frank was saying, was like ask yourself like, what are the problems that people are gonna have that I'm solving with my library in the first place. I built my library because I had this problem. So I have a newish library out in the Symfony world for authentication. It's actually based in part off of a Laravel interface. Yeah, and Frank has actually used it. And I basically asked myself that. People are going to say, how do I do a login form? How do I do HTTP basic? How do I log in with Facebook? Like those are like the problems that they're going to have. And so, in the documentation for that particular library is based around that. There's actually an entry that says like, well, the different pages are exactly that. They're titled exactly those things. And then they talk about it. It doesn't always work because it's entirely tutorial style. Tutorial style is always really good, but you can't cover. You run into some problems with tutorial style, like duplicate documentation, etc. But I think that's a really helpful way to go for, at least for part of your documentation, that kind of recipe section.
Well, kind of along those lines, do you have any advice for people who live in a very fast-paced environment and their APIs are constantly changing, and say they've got great documentation up there, but it's really hard to just keep it up to date with the constant changes? I don't know if you guys are really experiencing that with necessarily your open source projects, but maybe in your private projects where things change a lot more?
Well, you could do a different kind of DDD style, like do documentation-driven development. Get your documentation in line so you have the concepts clear on forehand before implementing it. Like you're changing stuff for a reason, formalize that reason first, base it off of that.
It sounds like behavior-driven development.
In a way, yeah. Like I use PHP spec a lot to do just general development stuff, and it forces me to actually know what I'm going to be solving on forehand, like on one end to get more like a bird's eye view, but also to have a sort of like reflection stage before you start coding. The same can be said for documentation. So use it to your advantage that you have documentation and you need to maintain it, and put it on the forefront.
One thing you can also do is, if you have a sort of a smaller project especially, is if you can put your documentation in the same repository as your project, like as a folder of, a folder docs with markdown files or whatever. That way if someone makes a pull request, they can make their change and their documentation change right there, like in the same pull request. Because a lot of times if you have to update the code and then go to like a separate repo to update the docs, like it doesn't get done a lot of times because people are busy and things get neglected or whatever. So if they can sort of make it as convenient as possible for people to update your documentation, that helps. But that also opens up a whole other can of worms, which I'm sure Ryan is probably familiar with. It. It's very hard to maintain open source documentation because everyone writes in a different voice and a different style, and it's very hard to have a lot of people contributing to your documentation. I would say probably like 80 to 90% of documentation pull requests I have to make some small modification just so it all sounds consistent and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. It's something you wouldn't do with code. You'd like maybe make sure they get the pull requests kind of like following the standards. Yeah. So like the reason, for example, that we use like funny thing is like British English versus American English. Who wins? Yeah. Do we have OUs in the word favorite? Do we use Z's instead of S's? So yeah, like all kinds of little things like that come up in the open source documentation world. Yeah, so it's a totally like random side thing, but yeah, like almost always I kind of tweak things, which is cool too because not everybody speaks English as their first language. So in an open source doc world, you can like merge their pull requests and say thanks, and they might not even realize that you had like one little commit to like fix their missing word. Because who cares, right? You just want them to feel good about having like the contribution. But yeah, there's all kinds of like weird little things like that. On the closed source documentation thing, I would always ask also, like, who will be reading your closed source documentation? Maybe nobody. Maybe nobody cares. I mean that like gently, but there's a good chance that.
It's like
Yeah.
if projects become of a significant size, documentation becomes increasingly more valuable. I've been onboarded on a couple of projects where there was documentation missing for significantly large parts of the application. In those situations, there was nothing else for me to do but spend like giving a piece of code the stare of death for 5 days straight in order to figure out what was going on. It's like
oh yeah, so I think that's important. That's like that. In that case, like you're also talking about like in code documentation, right? Like line comments and PHP doc.
That, but also like architectural stuff. Like if you've solved it on a larger scale in a particular manner, especially if stuff gets more abstract, you've done that for a particular reason. And the problem that you've encountered and the problem that you have solved might not be something that the guy who's working on it next has ever encountered. So when he sees a solution, but he doesn't see or know the problem, he just thinks he's looking at shit code.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah, so
I guess yeah, as I say, it means like again, like ask yourself the question, like is it needed? But sometimes it is going to be needed, but maybe we can at least minimize that. I'm a documentation guy, but I'm very anti documentation in a private repository unless you actually need it. Like I have done in the past, like there's big architectural things, or just documenting like this code lives here because like we're deployed on Amazon. There's this weird situation, and there's just no way anybody would know about that weird situation, like Frank was saying, unless you actually documented it. And then obviously, like in code documentation is like a super easy win. You have some really ugly function, you can put an apology right before it and say like why you wrote such an ugly function, stuff like that. But
add a link to
but mostly, like. Yeah, exactly, yeah. We have a hard enough time keeping up with open source documentation, let alone, closed source documentation. So you got to weigh your wins there, and also ask yourself if you're not writing the documentation in the code, then how is somebody expected to find it? So just make sure they'll be like, oh, of course, when they look here in this code, they're also going to have looked at this other spot, and so they will find the documentation. I feel like most of the time, a lot of times in projects, the people might write documentation, and then the other developers don't even realize it's there anyways. So it's sort of like a wasted effort.
True, but it's also like if you facilitate it nicely within the project. Like take away the hurdles, like adding documentation, changing documentation, compiling documentation if that's needed for your projects, then people will maintain it a lot more and a lot easier because you lower the barriers. I've seen projects where the documentation required you to install things like Sphinx and compile it down to PDF because they had used some settings that didn't go well with HTML, whatever. It's like if you have those kind of problems, just to be able to view the documentation, you're basically rendering them useless from the start. So they won't be maintained anymore, and they'll be your the legacy, like they'll be as bad as legacy code basically. Yeah.
I'm gonna.
The takeaway is we want to work on projects. We want to work on Frank's projects because he takes better care of them than I take care of mine.
The poster child. So I actually want to transition this a little bit into talking about APIs instead of just documentation. And I kind of want to, I don't know, not lead a question, but something that inspired this question was something that Taylor had mentioned a little while ago about the console component. But has the documentation process ever directly influenced your code base? And I'm kind of like nudging at Taylor at this one, specifically with the console component.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like documentation-driven development can be really powerful. The other DDD, I guess. But basically, this particular situation, to give something concrete, was I was reading through the documentation for Laravel 5.
Oh, we're losing Taylor. Tay.
Yeah.
Come back.
Oh, we got two Taylors in the room now.
What happened? What happened to me?
I don't know, but there's two of you now.
Hopefully they don't start arguing.
That'd be awesome. Anyway, I was reading through the docs for Laravel 5.1, and I was rewriting everything and trying to improve a lot because I had thought in my head for a while that Laravel docs were okay, that they were pretty decent, but reading through them, I was like, wow, these really suck in a lot of ways. And so I was kind of improving every section. I got to the console section for our console component, which is based on Symfony's console component. And just as I was reading the documentation, I was like, this is really lame. Like, it shouldn't be this hard to define a console argument or like an option. And so that spurred me to explore like other ways to make it easier to define those kinds of things, arguments and options that are passed into your console component. So, and that happens a lot. I mean, as I read through the documentation, I'll see that something just feels kind of gross and like it shouldn't be that hard, and I'll go tweak it in the code. That's happened several times.
That's awesome. Has that happened to you guys, Ryan or Frank?
Happens all the time. Yep, it's just like Taylor said. And I'll say two things. One thing is like, it's kind of like your code. You know, you look at your code 6 months later, and you're like, I was the worst programmer ever 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Depressingly, it looks like it's the same thing with documentation. So if you have some time and you have a library, you reread your documentation 6 months later, because you're gonna find out that you were a terrible writer six months ago. So I have the same experience with Symfony. Sometimes I'll read an article and I'll say, what idiot wrote this? And of course, get blame. It was me 3 years ago. But a lot of times those also lead to spots. We've definitely had it happen in Symfony as well. You read through something and you just have to have that light bulb go off. Sometimes you do things over and over and over again, and it's easy for you. So you have to kind of try to step back and allow the light bulb to come on to be like, making console arguments should not be these same 5 steps every single time, even though everyone has to do the exact same thing. It should just be one step, because that's what everybody does. So in the Symfony world, like I try to encourage people, I mean, across the PHP world, to kind of like have those light bulb moments, whether you are the writer of an open source library or whether like you're just a user of an open source library. So maybe I'm using Fly System and I realize that there's like 6 steps to do something. I'm doing it all the time, and maybe I can think of a slightly easier way to do it. It might even be as simple as like a new object or new function that puts those 6 steps together. So if I need to do something really custom, I can still call the 6 steps individually. But 99.9% of people are just doing that one thing. So hey, let's just call this one function and get it done.
Yeah, go for big wins.
Well, that's the whole concept of taking something that seems quite complex and making it a little bit easier for people. Isn't always necessarily a good thing, right? So I'm kind of nudging at Ryan at this one. When he gave a talk, he explained the difference between simple and easy, which seemed like the same thing when you first say it, but I don't want to steal the thunder for your future talks, but you had a really great point of explaining those two different concepts. Yeah,
and if I miss my big point now because it's been 6 months, you have to fill it in for me. But so the idea of simple versus easy, which is not something that I invented. You can like Google it. It's like this big debate of like what does simple versus what does easy mean. So here's like the 30-second thing. Simple means that there aren't many parts to it. So it's just kind of like it's simple. It's like you put this ball in this bucket and this happens. There's not a lot of pieces behind the scenes. And easy means close at hand. So I can push a button and lots of things happen. So the go-to example is like it's very simple to lose weight. I mean, come on, just exercise and eat right. But it's not easy because it's not close at hand. It actually requires you to wake up early in the morning. So extending this to kind of like APIs and how we think of our libraries, and again, this is sort of like you can read about this sort of philosophical opinion. The best case scenario is to make something simple first, So get rid of like all the cobwebs and all like the 50 different things that kind of need to go into solving a problem. Just try to solve your problem as simple as possible. So create an API that's very simple. Maybe it takes 50 lines of code to do something, but I can read those 50 lines of code like a story. You know, you can kind of think of a file system like this, you know, like different pieces that you need to kind of set up a file system and then start like reading and writing to it. And then once you have things simple, then you start thinking about the easier, like how can I put layers on top of this to kind of like solve the common problems so that people don't have to do 50 lines of code to do something. So again, the easiest like example of thinking about this, might not be the best example, is exactly what I just said. Like it really takes 50 lines of code to do something, but in reality I'm going to make a function that wraps those up into just one function. Or maybe you have like a class that has like 3 constructor arguments, which are these crazy factory objects that nobody understands at all and nobody ever needs to customize those, but those are still 3 required constructor arguments to your very important object. So you know, maybe you can actually just make those 3 arguments optional, and then in the constructor just instantiate a good default for them. So that way you still have a simple API, you can still kind of control the individual pieces yourselves, but you can also just use that object directly and never know or really care that there's all these crazy customizations that you could do, because you just say new object and it just kind of fills in the defaults for you.
Yeah, I would, like, for me as a non-English speaker, I like to switch terms if they make more sense to me, and the whole simple versus easy thing, for me, how I interpret it, it mostly comes down to clear versus easy. It's like everybody describing simple, for me, sounds like a description of, oh, it's clear this way, like you just said. Like you've got
I actually like that better. Yeah, clear.
Yeah. So simple and easy have like the commonality of like the words are sort of like synonyms, but there's a slight nuance, and I think that nuance is whether it's clear or not. It's like if simple becomes easy when you hide stuff that might be of interest to the people using it. As you said, like you've got 5 steps to do something. Well, it could have been one function, but what if somebody needs to go in there and alter some behavior? Like you've got the 99% use case, but what if I get off of that track and I need something else? Like, is it going to be a limiting factor then? If so, then it's easy, not simple, because it's not clear and it's hiding stuff from me.
Yeah, and actually that's one of like the things that I struggle with personally as far as like the API side of things, and maybe other guys have kind of similar experiences, is if I have those 5 function calls. So if I have those 5 function calls that you can write to do something, so which means that you can customize it at every step of the process. And then you have that decision of, do I provide a convenience function that does all those 5 things at once? And the immediate answer is, well, of course I would, because 99% of people are doing these 5 steps, so I put it in a shortcut function and we're good to go.
Go for big
but
ones.
recognizing that shortcut function has cost to it, because now that 1% of people that do need the 5 steps, they can do those 5 steps, but they might not even know those 5 steps exist, because all they see is this like button, you know, thing that says like client arrow authenticate with Facebook. And they're like, what the heck does that do? I have no idea what that does. Well, if they did a little digging, they would see it's just actually like 5 independent steps, but you're hiding those 5 steps from people. So I struggle with that a lot. Like, do you add a shortcut function to help people? Because it has a cost of actually making things a little bit less clear, even if technically your library is still super flexible. The 5 steps are there. They're just kind of like hidden a little bit.
Then again, if
you
can identify the cases why somebody might not be like in the 95% use case, and you can in a way name their situation, like custom scopes for Facebook authentication, like that's stuff that's Googleable, and if you include that in your documentation, then going back to the documentation side, then it's easy for people to discover that. So The 95% is the big win, facilitated, you're good to go. Make the rest of the stuff accessible by their use case and anticipate on how they're going to search for it.
So I'd love
Frank,
to
I love that answer.
That's a really great answer, because I was actually going to ask specifically about some Facebook authentication stuff since I work with the SDK so much. But I'd like to get Taylor's thoughts on obscuring complexity for the sake of easy. So if you have a process like we've been talking about, if it's 5 steps can be done in one line. In a specific situation where you have like an HTTP client making calls behind the scenes in certain cases, I feel like maybe that's kind of an important thing to know as a developer, whether your script's going to make external calls sometimes and then it's going to stay in-house sometimes. That kind of obscurity. Is that a good idea to kind of obscure all that for the sake of easy, or should those steps be broken out? Or maybe I'm asking too specific a question, but I just want to get your thoughts on simple versus easy and how it relates to Laravel and how you decide how to make things easy versus leave it just simple.
Yeah, I don't know. I can relate to the trouble in figuring out what the best solution is. A lot of times with Laravel in particular, we do kind of boil it down into one, like Ryan said, one function that you can call that does quite a bit under the hood. Maybe like with the Laravel Socialite, you can say socialize with Facebook redirect, and it's just all magical, and it's setting query string parameters and state in your session and stuff like that. And I don't always document the more complicated ways because it's hard to keep up with. It's a lot to kind of document every single customization option, and I think for me, I sort of have to decide, like, there is say let's just say use the 95 and 5%. There is 5% that might not be able to use it. I mean, the first question I have to ask is, do I care? And it sounds bad, but maybe you don't for various reasons. Maybe you're okay with sort of leaving them out to dry, and if they don't fit this use case, they can kind of roll their own code for that particular thing. So we've done that. For example, with Laravel Cashier, it only supports Stripe. That's just all we do, and it's just I don't want to take on the overhead of like trying to bake in all this customization so that you can add PayPal and Braintree and all kinds of other payment providers. So
or OmniPay.
Yeah. So sometimes that's just the decision you have to make, is that you're not going to worry about the other cases, and you're just going to try to provide a really good experience for this particular use case. Because the more you try to generalize, generally things become more convoluted. So the more you can kind of specialize and pick certain things, the more streamlined the experience is going to be, at the cost of losing some potential users. So it's always just a balancing act. Some things I try to make more flexible than others. Of course, things that are core to the framework, things like authentication or your session driver, those are things that need to be very swappable and need to cover a lot of use cases. Things that I build that are sort of nice to have, like Homestead, Cashier, those are not really like requirements of a web framework. They're just nice to have in some situations. Those I tend to be more opinionated on, and I'm more comfortable saying that this is our use case and we're not solving these other edge cases. And then with the framework itself, I'll try to be more flexible where possible.
It's like those things like Cashier. It's basically not Laravel's core feature set. You're basically reusing your vendor. And like we accept that same scope from people who are just creating packages for frameworks or integrations, like with bundles in Symfony. Like, people do it a certain way, and you have multiple solutions, because mostly in those parts it is about those little things like, how do I want this to work? Like, there are probably like 10 ways to hook Guzzle into Symfony, and all do a good job in some regard. But the most important thing they facilitate probably is personal preference. So you're facilitating one type of personal preference, and somebody else is free to do that as well, of course. Like, you're not obligated to do that, I'd say.
True that. Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, just real quick, the same thing goes back to documentation. If you don't say no, and we have this problem in the Symfony docs because I'm too much of a people pleaser, then that's how you end up with all those like 5 things of like notes, like about like some weird database driver edge case situation. So code documentation, like saying no to that last 0.1% case, 1% case, like if you don't say no, then it's coming at the cost of the other 99%.
Right. Yeah, good point.
Another example in that same thing was when we released Laravel Elixir, which is sort of it's basically just a Fluent layer on top of Gulp that makes it easier to do the common stuff. Like most people want to compile some SAS files or some maybe they're using like the new ECMAScript 6 JavaScript stuff and they want to use Babel.js to compile it. Like we could have tried to make some generic tool that like can either compile down to Grunt or Gulp or some other preprocessor thing, but we sort of just had to make a call like we're just going to do Gulp. Some people aren't going to like that, but that's okay because a lot of people are going to like it, and those are just sort of the hard decisions you have to make, and especially in larger framework type scenarios where you're catering to such a wide audience.
So this has been a really great discussion, guys. We're kind of running up on our hour, so we got to start wrapping it up here. Before we do, Taylor. I don't know where the Tay came from. I know I heard it on the Laravel podcast. Is that a Matt?
Can I use that?
Matt Stauffer says that.
I love it. There you have a doppelganger here in Chicago. I work out at a CrossFit down the street, and there's a guy who looks just like you. And I went up to him just recently, and I was like, "You wouldn't happen to be a computer programmer, would you?" And he goes, "Yeah, I am. I program in C++." And I was like, "No way."
That's awesome.
There's another computer programmer looks just like you. Oh, and before we kind of wrap up completely here, I want to move this on to developer shoutout because this is one of my favorite segments that recognizes a developer in the community who's contributed a lot to all of our understanding about things. And today the sponsor for this segment is Laracasts, and they're providing a $50 Amazon gift card to recognize a developer in the community. And Laracast, if you don't know, is the Netflix for developers. And if you're listening to the PHP Roundtable because you're trying to learn more about PHP, then you're absolutely going to love Laracast. The guy who runs it, Jeffrey Way, has a ton of screencasts showing you how to step-by-step do like really cool things in PHP. And I'm a subscriber. I've learned tons from Jeffrey. So definitely check it out at laracast.com. And for this episode, I asked the panel to nominate someone who has helped people understand better documentation and developer experience with their own projects. And the panel nominated Ross Tuck, he's been on the PHP Roundtable in a past episode and has been phenomenal. The way he just articulates himself and everything. Frank, why was Ross Tuck nominated for this?
Well, he's been working his ass off for a tactician, and like how he tackles that project, and there are so many parties in there involved from so many different frameworks who like what he's doing and like want to use it, and all give feedback on how he maneuvers himself between that is awesome, and how he re-articulates that stuff into the documentation that is for, like, it's at 0.6.1 and it's already like fully documented with many use cases, like how many projects can say that they've got docs in that state while they're basically like alpha released.
Yeah, so, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Ross, I will be sending you a $50 Amazon gift card. I'll be hitting you up to get your snail mail address to send that off to you. So thanks so much for what you do for the community, Ross. And finally, let's get some shameless plugs rocking. Just go down the line here. Frank, do you have anything that you'd like to promote?
Well, for me, it would just be Fly System. Like, if you need to manage file systems, whether local or remote, check out Fly System. I'm pretty sure you're going to like it.
And that's with the PHP League, right?
Yeah, and check out the rest of the projects from the PHP League.
Nice. Cool. What about you, Ryan? Do you have anything you want to promote?
Yeah, absolutely. Check out knpuniversity.com, knpuniversity.com. So we have screencasts and on Symfony stuff. Mostly that's where we come from. But also like a lot of other stuff at this point, like learning PHP and learning object-oriented. So if you already know that stuff, you have a friend who's like trying to get into PHP or trying to like wrap their head around the OO stuff. Created the OO stuff a lot for the Drupal audience since they're going to be launching a lot of OO stuff later this year. So go ahead and check that out as well. And all the, even if you're not a subscriber, we have all the code and scripts for free on the bottom of it. So if you're more of a reader, then we got you covered too.
Cool. What about you, Tay-Tay?
So Laravel Forge that's one of my kind of startup businesses. Basically, you can sign up and link your account to DigitalOcean and provision servers and deploy your PHP projects. And it's not just for Laravel. You can run Symfony, WordPress. People run no framework at all on Forge. So it's basically just a nice tool to provision your PHP servers. And then if you want zero downtime deployment, you can go to envoyer.io, ENVOYER.io, and that deploys PHP projects with zero downtime. Anyway, they're both linked on Laravel.com, so you can get to them fairly easily.
Nice. Well, our next episode is actually going to be at Laracon EU. No, not EU, US. I'm not going to go to Europe.
Too bad.
So I'm not really sure what that's going to look like. Doing live recordings are always kind of like last minute, kind of figuring out the specifics. So I'm looking forward to just figuring out how to air that. By the way, it's going to be in Louisville, Kentucky. For Taylor, I know you guys have been talking about it on different podcasts and stuff. And you're saying Louisville, but as a Kentuckian myself, I grew up in Kentucky. It's pronounced Louisville.
Yeah.
It's the only one that is pronounced
like Lowell's.
What's that?
I learned you're supposed to,
Yes.
You're supposed to say it like you have a mouthful of marbles.
Yes.
Lowell's.
There's only two.
Louisville.
There's only two syllables. Louisville.
Okay. Well, that's nice to know before I get there. I've been saying it wrong this whole time.
Yes. So you'll sound like a native if you say Louisville. They'll think you're from Kentucky. After that, we're going to be doing this interesting episode where we're going to be talking about alcohol, the unfit culture within the PHP community, and it should be kind of a fun topic. Might be a little serious and stuff, but there's a ton of people who I just kind of sent out a general tweet of anybody interested in giving insights on alcohol and being unfit in PHP. There was a great response, and we're actually maxed out with the maximum amount of people you can have in a Google Hangout. So it should be fun. I'm really excited for that one because that one affects a lot of people, I think, including myself. So looking forward to that. If you have something you would like to share about on the PHP Roundtable or know of any kind of topic that PHP nerds might care about, I'd love to hear from you. Just hit me up on Twitter. I'm Sammy K, or ping the PHP Roundtable with a topic idea, or just say, hey, I want to join and I want to talk about this, and that'd be great. So I'd like to just wrap up by thanking Frank, Ryan, and Taylor. Thank you guys for coming on and talking about developer experience and documentation, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.
See ya.
Yeah, thanks. Want to hang out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Okay, see ya.